All right, we'll do a few practice problems with the ambiguous case, just determining the number of triangles. All right. Again, this will be the resource that we use to determine number of triangles. Again, if it's acute angle versus obtuse angles, we'll just follow the flow chart. So here's our problems we'll look at. The first one, measure of angle A is 97 degrees, A is 19, and B is 12. In this case, we have an obtuse angle and the opposite and the adjacent. Because the opposite is greater than the adjacent, we'll just follow the flow chart. If I can get to the flow chart, there we go. Opposite is greater than the adjacent. There's only one triangle. One triangle exists. So this is just an exercise on using the flow chart. Number two, measure of angle B is acute. We've also been given the obtuse and the adjacent. I'm sorry, the opposite and the adjacent. Again, this is opposite. Little b is always opposite big B. And the other side will always be next to this angle. Whether this was an A or a C, both of those would be next to. So, in this case, we've got the opposite greater than the adjacent. If the angle is acute, opposite is greater than the adjacent. According to here, one triangle exists. There we go. Third problem. Measure of angle C is an acute angle, 26 degrees. A will be considered adjacent, while C is opposite. Again, little c is always opposite big C, and the other letter will be adjacent. In this case, the opposite is less than the adjacent. Opposite less than the adjacent. For an acute angle, we must find the height. There's our height. There's the formula we'll use. So the adjacent times sine of the angle, the adjacent 36, sine of 26, calculated would tell us about 15.78. So right now, the height is less than the opposite, which is less than the adjacent. The opposite was less than the adjacent, and we just found this height to be less than the opposite. That's the case where there's exactly two triangles. Next situation. Angle B, 57 degrees, acute. We've also been given the adjacent and the opposite. Right now, the opposite is less than the adjacent. Acute, opposite less than the adjacent. Must find the height. When we find the height, we happen to get 12.58. So right now, 12.58 compared to the 10, the height is greater than the opposite. So in this case, the opposite, yes, is less than the height. And according to the schematic, no triangles exist. To show again, opposite is less than the adjacent. Here we are. Opposite is less than the adjacent. And we just found the opposite to be less than the height. The opposite was less than the height. No triangles exist. So just a matter of just following the flow chart. A few more problems. Measure of angle B, 31 degrees, which is acute. We've also been given the opposite and the adjacent. Right now, the opposite is less than the adjacent. Opposite less than the adjacent. Must find the height. Then we'll compare the opposite and the height. Well, the height here, 71 sine 31. Calculator tells us a little over 36 degrees. Sorry, 36, a little over 36. Because right now, our height is less than the opposite, which is also less than the adjacent, that's our two triangles. Sixth one, we've been given an obtuse angle, the opposite and the adjacent. Right now, the adjacent is greater than the opposite, or the opposite less than the adjacent. We check the flow chart. Got an obtuse angle with the opposite less than the adjacent. Opposite less than the adjacent, no triangles. Number 7, 39 degrees is acute. We've got an adjacent side and an opposite. Right now, the opposite is greater than the adjacent. Check the flow chart. Acute, opposite, greater than the adjacent, one triangle. And the last one. We've got 50 degrees, which is acute. We've been given the adjacent and the opposite. Right now, the opposite is less than the adjacent. Opposite less than the adjacent. Got to find the height. Then we'll compare the opposite and the height. Well, once we find the height happens to equal 26.05. Compare that to the opposite. We end up with the height being less than the opposite, which was also less than the adjacent. There's our two triangles. So those are some guided practice. These are the independent practice problems you will complete.